A Navy SEAL thought he was just checking on a quiet neighbor after the storm. But his dog refused to leave a silent door that no one had opened in days. Inside, he found an old woman, still breathing, but not waiting to be saved. What followed wasn't a rescue, it was a choice that would challenge everything he believed. Because sometimes, helping someone means letting them decide how their story ends. And sometimes, the hardest thing isn't saving a life. It's respecting it. Before we begin, tell me where you're watching from. Share how this story makes you feel. And if you believe stories like this matter, please like and subscribe. Help us reach 1,000 subscribers so we can keep telling them. The snow had a way of swallowing sound. Not muting it, just taking it somewhere else. Like every step, every breath, every small noise drifted off and never quite came back the same. Gideon Rourke walked through it the way he did most things now, without hurry, but without pause either. 56 had settled into him, not as weakness, but as a kind of economy. He wasted nothing, not movement, not attention, not memory. A dark green winter jacket hung straight from his shoulders, worn but intact. Black jeans, tucked into scuffed combat boots that had outlasted more seasons than they should have. The kind of clothing that didn't ask to be noticed and didn't need to be. Beside him, slightly ahead, moved Ash. The German Shepherd's coat carried a dull winter sheen black, layered with ash gray along the flanks, like smoke frozen mid-rise. His gait was steady but measured, joints a little slower than they used to be, though you wouldn't notice unless you were looking for it. Gideon always noticed. The wind shifted through the pines, dragging thin ribbons of snow across the narrow path. The storm had passed some time in the early morning, but its presence lingered, settled into drifts that reshaped the land, erased familiar edges, softened every hard line into something uncertain. He paused at the edge of a small clearing. 3 houses sat within walking distance of each other out here. Not neighbors in the usual sense, just people who had ended up choosing the same kind of distance. Gideon checked them after storms. Not because anyone asked him to, because once, a long time ago, someone hadn't been checked in time. He didn't like repeating that. Ash slowed. It wasn't abrupt, just a subtle shortening of stride, a shift in the angle of his head. Gideon didn't speak. He followed. The dog moved toward the farthest house in the clearing, a small, weathered place with peeling paint and a narrow porch half buried in snow. Eleanor Pike's house. Gideon knew her the way you know people out here, through small exchanges and long silences, a wave from a distance, a brief conversation about weather that never really ended. She had a way of standing straight, even when the wind leaned hard against her, like she had already made peace with things most people still argued with. Ash stopped at the base of the steps. He didn't bark, didn't circle. He simply stood there, looking at the door. Then, slowly, he lifted one paw and scratched once. A light sound. Wood on claw. Gideon watched him. "Easy," he murmured, more habit than instruction. Ash scratched again, this time softer. Then came the sound Gideon hadn't heard from him in years. A low, restrained whine. Not fear, not pain. Something closer to concern. That was new. Gideon stepped up onto the porch. Snow creaked beneath his boots, compacting under weight. The air smelled faintly of old wood and cold iron. He knocked. The sound felt wrong in the stillness, too sharp, too deliberate. "Eleanor?" he called. Nothing. No movement inside. No shifting shadow behind the drawn curtains. No sound of a chair scraping, or a slow step approaching. He knocked again, harder. Still nothing. Ash moved closer to the door now, nose low, drawing in the air in short, careful pulls. His ears angled forward, then slightly back, like he was listening to something Gideon couldn't hear. Or maybe something that wasn't there. Gideon reached for his phone. One bar, flickering. He stepped off the porch, moving a few paces into the clearing, holding the device up as if height might coax a signal into existence. The line connected once, just long enough for a voice to break through in fragments. weather delay, emergency units, minimum response time. The call dropped. He stood there for a moment, staring at the dark screen. 5 hours, maybe more. In this cold? He exhaled slowly. Behind him, Ash let out another quiet sound. Not louder, just more urgent. Gideon turned back. Something about the house had shifted. Not physically, it looked the same. Same sagging porch rail, same snow-laced windows. But absence has a weight to it if you've lived long enough to recognize it. And this house felt empty in the wrong way. He walked back up the steps and tried the handle. Locked. Of course it was. He rested his hand there for a moment, longer than necessary. There was a time when doors like this were obstacles. Now, they felt more like questions. He knocked once more, this time pressing his ear briefly against the wood. Nothing. Not even the subtle creak of a structure settling. Ash pressed close to his leg. And then, unexpectedly, the dog lowered himself to the porch and let his head rest against the bottom of the door. Just for a second. Then he looked up at Gideon. There was no command in that look. No expectation. Just a quiet insistence. That was the moment something inside Gideon shifted. Not a decision. Not yet. More like a memory brushing past. Rain against glass. A hand slipping from his. The sound of someone saying "too late" in a voice that didn't belong to him but stayed anyway. He stepped back. The porch creaked under the sudden movement. "All right," he said, almost to himself. He didn't rush. He never rushed anymore. He moved to the side of the doorframe, braced one shoulder, and drove his weight forward. The wood gave with a sharp crack, splintering near the lock. The door swung inward, hitting the wall with a hollow thud. Cold air spilled out, not the biting sharpness of outside, but the dull, stagnant chill of a space that hadn't been warmed in too long. Gideon stepped inside. The smell came first. Not decay, not yet. Just stillness, dust, the faint, metallic trace of something left unattended. The room was dim, curtains drawn tight, light filtering through in thin gray lines. "Eleanor?" he called again. His voice sounded different inside the house. Smaller. Ash moved ahead of him now, slower than usual, each step deliberate. The dog's nails clicked softly against the wooden floor, then stopped. Gideon followed the line of his gaze and saw her. She lay on the floor near the kitchen entrance, one arm bent awkwardly beneath her, the other stretched toward a chair she hadn't reached. For a moment, time did something strange. It didn't stop. It didn't slow. It simply narrowed. Everything outside that room, snow, wind, memory, fell away. Gideon crossed the distance in 3 steps. He dropped to one knee beside her, fingers already moving to check her pulse. Cold skin, too cold. But there, faint, irregular, alive. "Hey," he said, voice low now, "stay with me." Her eyes were closed, breath shallow, almost imperceptible. Ash circled once, then lay down near her feet, watching. Not restless, not panicked, just present. Gideon slid one hand beneath her shoulder, careful not to jolt her more than necessary. The floor beneath her had leached warmth for hours, maybe longer. "How long?" he muttered, not expecting an answer. The clock on the wall had stopped. Of course it had. He glanced around quickly. No signs of struggle, no broken furniture, just a fall, a bad one. The kind that doesn't look like much, until it's everything. He looked back at her face. There was something there, something stubborn even in unconsciousness, a tension in the brow, like she hadn't gone quietly into this. Good. He preferred that. "All right," he said again, steadier this time. He pulled off his gloves, tucking them into his jacket, and shifted his grip to lift her. She was lighter than he expected. That bothered him more than it should have. As he rose, Ash stood too, moving close, almost brushing against Gideon's leg, as if anchoring himself to the motion. The cold outside rushed in through the broken door. Gideon didn't look back. Not at the house. not at the chair she had been reaching for. He stepped out into the snow, carrying her. Behind him, the open doorway yawned, silent, waiting, unchanged. The cabin held heat, the way an old memory holds, shape unevenly, imperfectly, but enough to matter. Gideon shouldered the door open with his back, snow falling from his jacket in loose clumps that melted slowly against the worn wooden floor. The air inside smelled of pine smoke and something metallic beneath it, tools, oil, the quiet residue of a life built on maintenance rather than decoration. Ash entered first. He didn't shake off the snow immediately like most dogs would. Instead, he circled once near the stove, then looked back at Gideon as if measuring something unseen. Gideon set Eleanor down carefully on the narrow couch by the fire. Her skin still carried the cold of the floor, not the outside something deeper, more stubborn, the kind of cold that settled into the body when time had been allowed to pass unchecked. He moved without thinking too much about it. Boots off, jacket open, blanket pulled from the back of a chair and wrapped around her shoulders. "Stay with me," he said again, though he knew she couldn't hear him yet not fully. Ash stepped closer. Then something happened that Gideon hadn't seen in years. The dog lowered himself beside the couch and pressed his body gently against Eleanor's legs. Not just proximity, contact, sustained. Gideon paused, one hand still gripping the edge of the blanket. "You sure about that?" he muttered. Ash didn't look at him, didn't move. That was answer enough. Gideon turned back to the stove, adding another log, adjusting the damper to coax the fire into something stronger but controlled. Too much heat too fast would do more harm than good. He moved to the small cabinet above the sink, pulling down a tin of salt, a half-used bottle of rubbing alcohol, a few worn cloths. Nothing clinical, nothing precise. Just enough. He knelt beside the couch again, gently lifting Eleanor's wrist, checking her pulse once more. Still there. Still thin. "All right," he said under his breath. "We've got time." But time, he knew, wasn't something you actually had. It was something you negotiated with. He worked slowly, rubbing warmth back into her hands, adjusting the blanket, keeping her positioned so she wouldn't choke if her breathing shifted. Outside, the wind rose again, brushing against the cabin walls in long, steady breaths. Inside, the fire answered. Minutes passed, maybe more. Then, a movement. Small, barely there. Eleanor's fingers twitched beneath the blanket. Ash felt it before Gideon saw it. His ears shifted slightly, his body tensing not in alarm, but in awareness. Gideon leaned forward. "Eleanor?" Her eyes opened. Not all at once. Not dramatically. Just enough. Confusion came first. Then, something sharper. Something closer to fear. She tried to move. Pain stopped her. A low sound escaped her throat, half breath, half protest. "Easy," Gideon said, keeping his voice steady. "You took a fall." Her gaze snapped to him then. Focused. Not drifting. That caught him off guard. She wasn't lost. She was present. And she didn't like what she saw. "Where?" Her voice broke, dry, thin. "Where am I?" "My place," he answered. "Your house wasn't safe. You'd been down a while." For a second, something in her expression softened. Not relief. Recognition. Then it hardened again. "No," she said. It wasn't loud, but it was absolute. Gideon blinked once. "No what? What?" "Don't," she swallowed, trying to push herself up. The effort failed, but the intent didn't. "Don't call them." He didn't answer immediately. Not because he didn't understand, because he did. Too quickly. "You need a hospital," he said instead. "You've been exposed to cold too long. Could be more than just the fall." Her hand shot out from beneath the blanket, gripping his sleeve with surprising strength. No. This time, it carried something else. Panic. Not the wild kind. The controlled kind, the kind that comes from knowing exactly what you're afraid of. Gideon studied her. Her pupils were clear. Her breathing, though shallow, was steadying. Her words, even strained, made sense. She wasn't confused. She was choosing. "I already tried calling," he said. "Signal's bad. Even if it worked, they're hours out." Her grip loosened slightly, but her eyes didn't. "Good," she whispered. That word landed heavier than it should have. Gideon leaned back a fraction. "Good?" he repeated. She turned her head slightly, staring past him at the wall, at nothing. "If they come," she said slowly, "they won't leave me here." There it was. Not illness, not injury. Fear of removal. Ash shifted again, his head now resting lightly against her knee beneath the blanket. Eleanor noticed. Her breathing hitched, not from pain this time, but something else. Carefully, almost hesitantly, she moved her hand toward him. Ash didn't flinch, didn't pull away. Her fingers brushed against the fur along his neck. Rough, warm, alive. For a moment, her expression changed. Not softer, just less guarded. Gideon watched it happen, didn't interrupt, didn't explain, because something about that moment didn't belong to him. Then she pulled her hand back, too quickly, as if she had remembered something. "You need to call someone," he said again, quieter now. She shook her head. "No, you can't stay like this." "I have." That stopped him. Not the words. The certainty behind them. Gideon exhaled slowly, running a hand across the back of his neck. He'd seen this before. Not here. Not like this. But the shape of it, the refusal, the line drawn not out of stubbornness but out of something deeper was familiar. "You fall again," he said. "No one finds you next time." She met his gaze. "Then I won't be found." The room shifted around that sentence. Not physically, but in weight. Ash let out a soft breath, almost a sigh, and adjusted slightly, pressing closer. Eleanor's hand hovered again. This time, she didn't hesitate as long. She rested it against his shoulder. Gideon looked away. Not out of discomfort, out of respect. The fire crackled, a log shifting inward as it burned. Outside, the wind carried something distant, branches scraping, snow slipping from higher ground. Time moved again. Slow, deliberate. "You always do this?" Eleanor asked suddenly, her voice steadier now. "Do what?" "Break into houses." Gideon almost smiled. "Only the locked ones." A pause. Then, faintly, the smallest hint of humor crossed her face. Gone just as quickly. But it had been there. That mattered. He stood, moving toward the small table near the window, picking up his phone again. Still, no signal. He turned it over in his hand once, then set it back down. No call. Not yet. Behind him, Eleanor spoke again. "Don't make this worse," she said. He didn't turn around. "Depends what you think worse is." Another pause. Longer this time. Then, "Being taken somewhere," she said quietly, "where no one asks what you want." Gideon closed his eyes for a brief second. Just one. Then opened them again. Ash didn't move. Didn't question. He simply stayed where he was, anchored beside her like something that had already made its decision. Gideon turned back toward them. The firelight flickered across the room, catching in the lines of Eleanor's face, in the worn edges of the furniture, in the quiet space between people who hadn't agreed on anything, but hadn't turned away either. "All right," he said finally. Not agreement. Not refusal. Just something in between. Eleanor watched him carefully, not trusting, but no longer pushing him away. For now, that was enough. Morning did not arrive all at once. It seeped in, through the thin edges of the curtains, through the slow change in the color of the snow outside, from deep blue to something flatter, more honest. Gideon was already awake. He hadn't slept much, not from worry, not exactly. It was something closer to recalibration, the kind his body defaulted to when circumstances shifted, but hadn't settled yet. Ash lay stretched along the floor near the couch, one ear angled toward Eleanor without fully opening his eyes. A habit. not guarding, not watching, just staying aware. Eleanor was still asleep, or resting. The difference mattered. Her breathing had steadied overnight, not strong, but no longer fragile enough to disappear between seconds. The blanket had slipped slightly from her shoulder, exposing skin that no longer carried that deep, unmoving chill. Gideon stepped closer, adjusting it without waking her. He didn't linger. There were things that needed checking. He moved quietly to the door, pulling on his boots, shrugging back into his jacket. The cold greeted him immediately as he stepped outside, clean, sharp, indifferent. The clearing looked different in daylight. The storm had erased most tracks, flattened edges, made everything seem farther apart than it really was. He turned toward Eleanor's house. The door still hung slightly open from where he had forced it. Snow had begun to drift inward, dusting the floor just inside. Gideon walked over, pushing it wider with his boot. Inside, the cold had settled deeper. Not hostile, just complete. He stepped in again, slower this time, without urgency. Now that she was out, the place felt smaller. Or maybe it just felt more honest. He moved through the rooms with quiet efficiency, checking for anything she might need, medications, papers, something that would explain the sharp edge behind her refusal. The kitchen was simple, barely stocked. A kettle, a few canned goods, a knife left out on the counter like it had been used recently. No signs of neglect, just minimalism pushed a little too far. Then he saw it, a folded document on the table, held in place by a chipped ceramic mug. Not hidden, not displayed either, just left. Gideon picked it up. The paper had that official weight to it, thicker than it needed to be, stamped with authority that carried more force than its words. Notice of structural unsafety. He read the rest quickly. Inspection failed, heating system unreliable, risk factors noted, recommendation, relocation pending, evaluation. Relocation. He exhaled through his nose. That word again. It sat heavier on the page than it should have. A second paper lay beneath it, more recent, less formal, but more direct. Follow-up required, non-response noted, case escalation pending. At the bottom, a name, Marlene Shaw. Gideon folded the papers back the way he found them, not carefully, just correctly. He set them down, the mug returning to its place, like a weight on more than paper. For a moment, he stood there, looking at the table, at the empty chair beside it, at the space where someone had been making decisions alone for longer than anyone had noticed. Then Ash's bark cut through the quiet. Sharp, not loud, but intentional. Gideon turned immediately and stepped back outside. A vehicle had pulled up at the edge of the clearing. Not fast, not aggressive, just certain. A dark SUV, dusted with snow, engine still idling. The kind of vehicle that didn't belong out here often, but when it did, it stayed long enough to matter. The driver's door opened. A woman stepped out. Mid-40s maybe. Dark hair pulled back in a way that suggested practicality over style. A long coat, functional, not expensive. Boots that had seen more pavement than snow, but held their ground well enough. She didn't rush. She didn't hesitate either. She walked forward with the kind of balance people carried when they had learned to be both careful and persistent at the same time. Ash stood still beside Gideon, not moving forward, not retreating, watching. The woman stopped a few feet away. "You're not Eleanor Pike," she said. Her voice wasn't accusatory, just factual. Gideon shook his head once. "No." She nodded, taking that in without surprise. "I'm Marlene Shaw." He didn't need the introduction. "I saw the notice," he said. "Then you know why I'm here." He glanced back toward the house. "She's not inside." Marlene's gaze sharpened slightly. "Not alarm. Not yet." "Where is she?" "At my place." A pause. Not long, but enough. Marlene studied him now, not just his words, but the way he stood, the way Ash remained at his side, the lack of urgency in his tone. "You moved her," she said. "Yes, without contacting anyone." Signal's bad, he replied. Response time worse. That's not the same as not trying. I tried. That landed differently. Not defensive, just complete. Marlene exhaled slowly, looking past him toward the cabin in the distance. How bad is she? Better than she was, Gideon said. Still needs attention. And you decided that attention was you? He didn't answer that right away. Instead, he asked, You've been coming out here a while? 6 months, she said. Off and on. And she never answered. No. Gideon nodded slightly. That bother you? Marlene didn't react to the question the way most people would. She didn't get defensive. Didn't deflect. It's my job, she said simply. People not answering tends to mean something. And now it does. Another pause. The wind shifted between them, carrying fine grains of snow across the ground in soft, restless lines. Marlene looked at Ash. He always this quiet? When he needs to be. She studied the dog for a moment longer than necessary. Mind if I see her? Gideon didn't answer immediately. Not because he was deciding, because he already had. He just needed a second to acknowledge it. She doesn't want anyone called, he said. I'm not anyone, Marlene replied. No, Gideon said. You're exactly who she doesn't want. That changed something. Not the situation, just the air inside it. Marlene folded her arms, not in defense, but in consideration. And you're going to respect that? Gideon met her chaze. I'm going to see what she's capable of deciding first. A long moment passed between them. Then, Marlene nodded once. Fair enough, she said. That was the re-hook moment. Not agreement. Not conflict. But something more dangerous. Mutual recognition. Gideon turned toward the cabin. She's awake, he said. She'll tell you herself. Marlene followed. Not behind him, not ahead. Just alongside. At a distance that left room for both caution and possibility. Ash moved between them for a few steps, then drifted back toward Gideon's side, as if choosing a position without needing to explain it. The cabin came into view slowly. Smoke curled faintly from the chimney now. A sign of warmth. A sign of presence. Marlene noticed. Better than I expected, she said. Don't expect too much, Gideon replied. They reached the door. He opened it without knocking. Inside, the fire had settled into a steady burn. Eleanor sat upright now, the blanket wrapped around her shoulders, her posture fragile but deliberate. Her eyes moved first to Gideon, then to Marlene, and something inside them tightened. Recognition. Immediate. Unwelcome. You, she said. Marlene didn't step forward, didn't soften, didn't harden either. Me, she answered. Silence followed. Not empty, not passive. The kind that carries decisions inside it. Gideon stepped aside slightly, not leaving, but not standing between them either. Ash remained where he was, watching both women now. Eleanor's hand tightened on the edge of the blanket. You weren't supposed to find me like this, she said. Marlene tilted her head slightly. I wasn't supposed to find you at all. That landed harder. Eleanor looked away first. Not defeated, just calculating. Gideon watched it unfold. Didn't interrupt, didn't guide. Because this wasn't his moment to control. It never had been. No one spoke for a long time. The cabin seemed to hold its breath not out of fear, but out of recognition that something fragile had entered the room and shouldn't be rushed. Eleanor didn't look at Marlene again right away. Instead, she adjusted the blanket around her shoulders with deliberate care, as if restoring control over something small before addressing something larger. Gideon stayed where he was, just off to the side. Not withdrawn, not involved. A position learned long ago, close enough to act, far enough not to interfere. Ash remained near the stove, though his attention had shifted. He no longer watched Eleanor alone. Now he tracked the space between her and Marlene, as if aware that whatever passed between them carried more weight than either would show. Marlene was the first to move. Not forward, just enough to shift her stance. I came out here because you stopped answering, she said. Her tone wasn't sharp. It wasn't soft either. It held something measured, like someone choosing each word not to win, but to be heard. Eleanor let out a quiet breath. I didn't stop, she said. I just didn't start. Marlene absorbed that. Didn't challenge it. Your house isn't safe, she said instead. You know that. Eleanor nodded once. Yes. Then why stay? That question didn't land the way most questions did. It didn't provoke. It didn't accuse. It simply waited. Eleanor's fingers tightened slightly in the folds of the blanket. For a moment, Gideon thought she wouldn't answer. Then she did. Because it's the only place he still exists. The words settled slowly. Not dramatic. Not heavy-handed. Just final. Marlene frowned slightly. Not confusion, more like recalibration. Who? She asked. Eleanor looked up then. Past Gideon. Past Ash. Directly at Marlene. My husband. Silence again. But this time it felt different. Not empty. Occupied. Marlene took a step closer, not aggressively, but with purpose. I didn't see any records, she said. No emergency contacts. No next of kin listed. Eleanor almost smiled. Not warmth. Not humor. Just recognition of something inevitable. You wouldn't, she said. Gideon shifted slightly where he stood, not because he needed to move, because something in the room had begun to change shape. Eleanor turned her gaze away from Marlene, toward the fire. The flames reflected faintly in her eyes, flickering against something older than the moment. He wasn't from here, she said. Marlene waited. Gideon did too. Because this, whatever it was, wasn't something you interrupted. He wasn't from this country, Eleanor added. That landed differently. Marlene's posture tightened almost imperceptibly. Not suspicion. Awareness. Gideon felt it too. Not as surprise, as recognition. Eleanor continued, her voice steady now, not stronger, but more certain. We met after everything was already over, she said, or at least after people decided it was. She shifted slightly on the couch, adjusting her weight with a quiet wince that she didn't acknowledge. He didn't come here looking for anything, she went on. He came here because there wasn't anywhere else he could go. Marlene crossed her arms, not defensively, but to hold still. What does that have to do with you staying in a house that could collapse? She asked. Eleanor's eyes moved back to her, and for the first time, there was something sharper there. Because that house is the only place where he isn't a file, she said. Gideon felt that one, not as a statement, as impact. Eleanor leaned back slightly, her hand brushing unconsciously against Ash's fur. The dog didn't move, but his ears flicked once, acknowledging the contact. He was part of something people don't like to remember clearly, she continued. So they don't. They reduce it, simplify it, turn it into something easier to carry. Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. They turn men into lines in reports, she said, or worse, into examples. Marlene didn't interrupt, didn't argue, but something in her expression shifted again, not agreement, not disagreement, just consideration. Eleanor exhaled slowly. He wasn't innocent, she said. That was the rehook moment. Not because it shocked, because of how plainly she said it. No defense. No justification. Just truth, laid out without protection. Gideon felt something tighten behind his ribs. Eleanor continued before anyone could respond. He told me everything, she said. Not all at once. Not like a confession. Just in pieces. Over time. The way people tell the truth when they don't expect forgiveness. Ash shifted slightly, adjusting his position, but staying close. Marlene spoke carefully. And you stayed? Eleanor nodded. Yes. Why? This time, Eleanor didn't answer immediately. She looked down at her hands, at the way they rested against the blanket, at the way they had aged without asking permission. Then she said quietly, Because he was more than what they needed him to be. The room went still again. Not tense, just full. Gideon moved then. Not toward them, just enough to lean against the wall, crossing his arms loosely. He wasn't part of this conversation, but he wasn't outside it either. Marlene took another step, closer now, still careful. "And the house?" she asked. Eleanor's gaze drifted again, this time not to the fire, but somewhere beyond it. "That's where he lived," she said. "Not just physically. That's where he was allowed to be, a person." She swallowed once. "And if I leave it," she added, "then he disappears the way everything else did." Marlene opened her mouth, closed it, tried again. "You understand that staying there could kill you," she said. Eleanor nodded. "I do. And you're willing to risk that?" Eleanor looked at her again. This time, there was no hesitation. "Yes." The answer didn't feel dramatic. It felt resolved. Ash let out a slow breath, resting his head more firmly against Eleanor's leg. Gideon watched Marlene closely now, waiting, not for what she would say, for what she would do, because that mattered more. Marlene stood still for a long moment, long enough that the fire shifted again, sending a small crack of sound through the room. Then she exhaled, not sharply, not heavily, just letting something go. "I need to understand one thing," she said. Eleanor waited. Marlene met her eyes. "Are you choosing this?" she asked. "Or are you afraid of the alternative?" The question didn't land like the others. It went deeper. Eleanor's fingers tightened again, but not from fear, from focus. "I'm choosing it," she said. Marlene held her gaze, testing it, measuring it. Then she nodded once. Small, but real. Gideon saw it, and knew something had shifted again. Not resolved, but moved. The kind of movement that doesn't show on the surface until much later. Ash's tail tapped once against the floor. Quiet, almost absent-minded, but it broke the stillness just enough to remind them all that time hadn't stopped. It never did. The fire had burned lower by the time anyone moved again. Not out, just settled like something that had already said what it needed to say. Marlene stepped back first. It wasn't retreat. It was distance. The kind people create when they need space to think without being watched doing it. "I filed the report," she said. The words didn't come with apology. They came with weight. Eleanor didn't react immediately. Her hand remained resting on Ash's shoulder, fingers barely moving against the dog's thick coat. "I assumed you would," she said quietly. Marlene nodded once. "It's already in the system," she added. "That doesn't change just because I'm standing here." Gideon shifted his weight slightly against the wall. This was different now. No longer about understanding. Now, it was about what happened next. "And what does the system say?" he asked. Marlene glanced at him, then back at Eleanor. "It says I have a responsibility to assess her condition," she said. "And if she's at risk—" "I am at risk," Eleanor interrupted. Not sharply, not defensively, just factually. Marlene paused. "That's not what I meant." "It is," Eleanor said. "You just don't like how I define it." Silence settled again, but this time it felt tighter, more directional. Marlene exhaled through her nose, slow and controlled. "Risk isn't something you get to define alone," she said. Eleanor's eyes flickered, just briefly. "That's exactly what it is." That landed harder than before. Not because it was louder, because it was clearer. Ash shifted slightly between them, not stepping forward, not backing away, just repositioning, as if recalibrating the space he occupied in the room. Gideon watched that more closely than the conversation, because Ash didn't react to words. He reacted to something beneath them. Marlene moved again. Closer now, but not toward Eleanor directly. Toward the small table near the window. She picked up Gideon's phone, turning it in her hand once before setting it back down. "No signal?" she asked. "Not reliable," Gideon replied. "Figures." She looked back at Eleanor, I can't just walk away from this, she said. Eleanor nodded. I know. Marlene's brow tightened slightly. But you're asking me to. I'm not asking, Eleanor said. That shifted it again. Gideon straightened slightly. Marlene's posture followed. Then, what are you doing? She asked. Eleanor took a slow breath. Her hand moved from Ash's shoulder back to the blanket, folding it carefully across her lap. I'm staying, she said. The simplicity of it made it heavier. Marlene looked at her for a long moment. Then, she did something unexpected. She sat down, not across from Eleanor, not beside her, just near enough that leaving would take effort. You understand what happens next, she said. Eleanor didn't answer. Because she didn't need to. Marlene continued. There'll be a follow-up, she said. Probably within a week. Maybe sooner, depending on how fast they move it. Gideon spoke this time. And if she's still here? Marlene met his eyes. Then it becomes formal. He understood that. Not the paperwork. The inevitability behind it. Ash let out a slow breath, then rested his head against Eleanor's knee again. The contact wasn't new, but something about it felt more intentional now, as if the dog had chosen a side. Marlene noticed. Does he always do that? She asked. No, Gideon said. That was enough. Marlene looked back at Eleanor. You don't have anyone else? She asked. Eleanor shook her head. No, no family. No, no one who could. No. The repetition wasn't defensive. It was final. Marlene nodded slowly. All right, she said. And for a moment, it sounded like acceptance. But it wasn't. It was calculation. The kind that happens when options don't disappear, they just stop fitting cleanly. She leaned forward slightly, resting her elbows on her knees. I need to ask you something, she said. Eleanor looked at her. Marlene held her gaze. If you fall again, she said, if something happens, do you expect him to keep doing this? She nodded toward Gideon. Eleanor didn't look at Gideon. Didn't need to. No, she said. That was the re-hook moment. Because of how easily it came. Not reluctance. Not hesitation. Just truth. Gideon felt it, before he understood it. Marlene did too. Then what are you asking him to do? She asked. Eleanor's gaze shifted this time, not to the fire, not to the walls, to the door. The one Gideon had opened hours earlier. I'm not asking him to do anything, she said. Marlene frowned slightly. Then why are you here? Eleanor's fingers tightened briefly on the edge of the blanket, then relaxed. Because he chose to open the door, she said. Gideon didn't move. But something in him did. Not visible, not measurable, but real. Marlene leaned back slowly, absorbing that. So, this is his choice now? She asked. No, Eleanor said. It was his choice then. The distinction mattered, more than anyone wanted to admit. Ash shifted again, lifting his head slightly, looking between them as if tracking something that hadn't fully formed yet. Marlene stood. Not abruptly, just finished sitting. She adjusted her coat, brushing a bit of ash from the sleeve. I can delay the follow-up, she said. Gideon looked up. Eleanor didn't react. Not cancel, Marlene added. Not stop, just slow it down. How long? Gideon asked. A few days, she said. Maybe more, if things get backed up. That's not much. It's not supposed to be. That was honest. Uncomfortably so. Marlene stepped toward the door, then paused. She looked back at Eleanor. If I do this, she said, you don't disappear on me again. Eleanor met her gaze. I won't, she said. Marlene nodded once. Then she looked at Gideon. And you don't pretend this isn't happening. Gideon held her gaze. I don't pretend, he said. That seemed to satisfy her. Or at least not contradict anything she needed to believe. Ash stood as she moved toward the door, watching her without tension. Just awareness. Marlene opened it, letting the cold air rush in briefly. Before stepping out, she stopped. People think systems are rigid, she said, not turning around. They're not. They just need pressure in the right places. Then she stepped outside. The door closed behind her. Silence returned. But not the same silence as before. This one had direction. Eleanor leaned back slightly against the couch. Her hand found ash again, resting there without hesitation. Gideon pushed himself off the wall, moving slowly toward the fire. He adjusted the logs without looking at either of them, because for the first time since this had started, there wasn't a clear next step, only time, and what they chose to do with it. The storm didn't announce itself this time. It returned. Quietly. The kind of snow that doesn't fall, it drifts sideways, carried by wind that doesn't need to be strong to be persistent. Gideon noticed it first in the way the light changed. Not darker, just thinner, like the sky had decided to hold something back. He stood by the window, one hand resting against the frame, watching the clearing blur at its edges. Behind him, the cabin was quieter than it had been all day. Not tense, not heavy, just settled into something that didn't need explaining anymore. Eleanor hadn't said much after Marlene left. Neither had he. There wasn't anything left to negotiate. Only what came next. Ash lay near the door this time, not the couch. Not guarding, positioning. The dog's head rested on his paws, but his eyes were open, tracking the space in a way that suggested he was waiting for something not outside, but inside the room. Gideon turned slightly. "You planning to stay there all night?" he asked. Ash didn't move, didn't answer, but his ears flicked once, acknowledging the voice. That was enough. Gideon looked toward Eleanor. She was sitting upright now, though it cost her something. You could see it in the way her shoulders held tension that wasn't there before, in the way her hands moved more carefully, like they had learned something overnight they weren't willing to forget. "You should rest," he said. She shook her head. No, not defiant, just decided. He didn't argue. Instead, he moved toward the stove, adding another log, adjusting the draft. Routine. Something solid in a moment that wasn't. "You don't have much time," she said. He glanced at her. "For what?" She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she looked toward the door. Not the one Ash was near. The other one, the back. The one that led out toward the narrow path between the trees, the path that curved just enough to hide the house from view after a few steps. Gideon followed her gaze, then looked back at her. "You planning something?" he asked. Eleanor almost smiled. Not with humor, with recognition. "I already did," she said. That was the moment everything shifted. Not loudly, not dramatically, just completely. Ash stood. No hesitation this time. He moved toward her, stopping just close enough that his presence could be felt without touching. Gideon straightened. "What does that mean?" he asked. Eleanor pushed herself up slowly. The effort showed now, not in weakness, but in cost. Every movement had weight. But she didn't stop. "I'm going home," she said. Gideon didn't respond immediately. Not because he didn't understand, because he did, too clearly. "You're not strong enough for that," he said. She didn't argue, didn't deny it. "That's not what this is about." Ash shifted again, moving slightly ahead of her, then pausing, waiting. Gideon watched that more closely than her words. Because Ash wasn't reacting. He was anticipating. "You fall out there," Gideon said. "That's it." Eleanor met his gaze. Yes. No fear. No hesitation. Just agreement. The re-hook moment. Because she wasn't resisting the risk. She was accepting it. Gideon exhaled slowly, rubbing a hand across his jaw. "You said you weren't asking me to do anything," he said. "I'm not," she replied. "Then what is this?" Eleanor adjusted the blanket around her shoulders, though she didn't need it anymore. "Not really. It's me deciding where I'm supposed to be," she said. The simplicity of it didn't make it easier. It made it harder. Gideon stepped forward. Not blocking her. Not guiding her. Just closer. "You think that house is going to hold up in this?" he asked, nodding toward the window. Eleanor followed his gaze briefly, then back to him. It held before. That doesn't mean it will again. No, she said. It doesn't. Ash moved toward the back door now. He didn't scratch, didn't bark. He just stood there, waiting. Gideon watched him, something tightening in his chest. You're not helping, he muttered. Ash didn't look back. Eleanor took a step, slow, measured, but forward. That was all it took. Gideon moved too, not to stop her, to be there when she did it. He opened the back door before she reached it. The cold came in immediately, sharper now, cutting through the cabin air with something more aggressive than before. Snow moved across the ground in low, restless patterns. Not deep, but enough. Eleanor didn't hesitate at the threshold. She paused, just for a second. Not from doubt, from recognition. Then she stepped out. Ash followed, not beside her, slightly ahead. Gideon stayed in the doorway for a moment longer, then stepped out after them. The path was still there, barely. A narrow line where the snow had settled just differently enough to suggest direction rather than conceal it. Eleanor moved along it slowly, not steady, but deliberate. Ash adjusted his pace to match hers, not pulling, not leading, just aligning. Gideon walked behind them, close enough to reach, far enough not to interfere. The trees closed in as they moved deeper. The clearing disappeared behind them, replaced by the quiet density of pine and shadow. The wind shifted again, threading through branches, carrying the faint sound of snow slipping from higher limbs. Eleanor stopped once, not because she had to, because she chose to. She looked back, at Gideon, at the distance they had already covered, at something that wasn't visible anymore. You can go back, she said. Gideon didn't answer. She studied him for a moment, then nodded slightly, as if confirming something she had already known. They continued. The house appeared slowly, not all at once. First the edge of the roof, then the outline of the porch, then the door still slightly broken from where Gideon had forced it. Eleanor stopped again, this time longer. Ash sat down beside her, not tired, waiting. Gideon stepped up beside them. For a moment, none of them moved. The house didn't look stronger in daylight, didn't look safer, but it looked certain. Eleanor took a breath, then another, then stepped forward. Gideon moved past her, reaching the door first. He pushed it open wider, clearing the snow that had drifted inside. The air within was colder than before, but not empty, not anymore. Eleanor stepped inside, slowly, carefully, like someone returning to a place that had never stopped being theirs. Ash followed, then Gideon. The door remained open behind them, not forgotten, not ignored, just left that way, because closing it would have meant something, and none of them were ready to decide what that was yet. The cold inside the house didn't fight them. It accepted them. That was the first thing Gideon noticed. Not resistance, not hostility, just a space that had been waiting long enough to stop expecting anything different. He stepped in after Eleanor, closing the distance between them without touching her, not guiding, not supporting, just making sure she didn't have to fall alone if she did. Ash moved through the room first, slow and deliberate, not searching, remembering. The dog paused near the far wall, nose low, tracing a path along the edge of the floor as if following something invisible that had never quite faded. Eleanor stood just inside the doorway. For a moment, it looked like she might not make it further. Not because she couldn't, because she was deciding whether she needed to. Then she moved. One step, then another. Not toward the chair she had fallen beside. Not toward the kitchen. Toward the center of the room. Gideon watched the way she carried herself now. There was no illusion of strength left, but there was no hesitation either. That mattered more. You left it like this, he said quietly, glancing at the broken edge of the door, the snow that had drifted across the floorboards. Eleanor nodded. It's not the first time the weather's come in uninvited. she said. Her voice wasn't strained anymore. It had changed. Not stronger, just settled. Ash circled once near the stove, then lay down beside it, resting his body against the cold metal as if trying to share warmth rather than receive it. Gideon moved toward the fireplace. The wood there was stacked, but not recently. He knelt, setting it properly, rebuilding something that had been interrupted but not abandoned. The motions came easily, hands remembering what didn't need thought. Behind him, Eleanor reached the chair, the same one she had been reaching for the night before. She didn't sit immediately. She rested her hand on the back of it first, as if confirming it was still there. Then, slowly, she lowered herself down. The movement cost her. He could see it. But she didn't stop halfway, didn't ask for help. When she finally settled, she exhaled once. Long, measured, finished. Gideon lit the fire. It took a moment to catch. The wood was dry enough, but the room had forgotten what heat felt like. Then, a small flame. Then another. Then something that held. The light changed. Not brighter. Warmer. He sat back on his heels, watching it build. Not because it needed watching, because it felt right to. Eleanor's gaze had drifted to the far wall. Gideon followed it. There was a photograph there. Simple frame, nothing polished. A man stood beside her in it. Younger, thinner, wearing a uniform that didn't belong to this country. But that wasn't what held attention. It was the way he stood. Not proud, not rigid, just present, as if he had learned how to exist without asking permission. Eleanor spoke without looking away. He didn't like pictures, she said. Gideon didn't respond. He said they fixed things in place, she continued. And most things weren't meant to stay like that. She paused, but I kept one anyway. Ash lifted his head slightly, as if the sound of her voice had shifted something in the room. Gideon stood slowly, brushing his hands against his jeans. You should lie down, he said. Eleanor shook her head. No, not defiance. Just completion. I'm where I need to be, she added. He didn't argue. There wasn't a version of this conversation that changed anything now. Time moved differently in that room. Not slower, just more honest. Ash shifted again, moving closer to Eleanor this time, settling beside her chair instead of the stove. The dog didn't rest his head on her leg, didn't lean into her. He simply stayed close. That was enough. Gideon moved toward the door, not to leave, just to close it. He hesitated for a moment, hand on the edge of the broken frame, then pushed it shut. The wind outside softened immediately. Not gone, just distant. The house held its shape again. For a while, no one spoke. The fire burned. The snow moved outside. The room existed exactly as it was. Then Eleanor reached into the pocket of the coat she still wore. Her hand came out with something small, a folded piece of paper. Not official, not marked, just kept. She held it for a moment before speaking. I wrote this a long time ago, she said. Gideon stayed where he was. Didn't move closer. Didn't ask. She unfolded it slowly, the edges worn from being handled more than once. It's not important what it says, she added. That wasn't the rehook. What came next was, I just didn't want it to stay unwitnessed. That word unwitnessed hung in the air differently. Not dramatic, but absolute. Eleanor placed the paper on the small table beside her, not handing it to Gideon, not asking him to take it, just leaving it where it could be seen. Ash let out a slow breath, then rested his head lightly against the side of the chair. Gideon looked at the paper, then at her, then back at the fire. I'm not going anywhere, he said. It wasn't a promise. It wasn't a decision. It was a statement. Eleanor nodded once. That was enough. Time passed. It had to. There was no other direction for it to go. At some point, the fire settled into a steady burn. At some point, the wind shifted again. At some point, the room stopped feeling like something in transition and became something else entirely. Gideon didn't mark when it happened. He just noticed when Ash didn't move for longer than usual. The dog's breathing had slowed. Not sleeping, watching, waiting. Then, stillness. Not sudden, not sharp, just the absence of something that had been there a moment before. Gideon turned. Eleanor sat in the chair, exactly as she had been, except for one thing. She was no longer holding anything in place. There was no tension in her shoulders, no resistance in her hands, no unfinished motion, just rest. Ash didn't react immediately. He remained where he was, head against the chair, eyes open. Then he closed them, slowly. Gideon stepped forward. Not fast, not slow, just enough. He checked her pulse, out of habit, not expectation. There was nothing. He didn't move right away, didn't speak, didn't reach for anything else. He simply stood there. Then he looked at the photograph on the wall, then at the paper on the table, then at the fire. The house held everything exactly as it was. Nothing taken, nothing added, just complete. Outside, the snow continued to fall. Not harder, not lighter, just enough to cover what didn't need to be seen anymore. Some people are not waiting to be saved, they are waiting to be seen and allowed to remain where their love still lives. Gideon did not change Eleanor's ending. He honored it. And sometimes, that is the quiet kind of courage life asks from us, the kind that doesn't fix, doesn't rescue, but stays present when it matters most. In a world that moves quickly to decide for others, there is something sacred in choosing to listen and to respect a life that has already chosen its own meaning. If this story stayed with you, share where you're watching from or what part touched you most. And if you believe stories like this still matter, you're always welcome to stay, to listen, and to be part of this space. May you find peace in the places that still hold your memories, and may you never feel unseen in the moments that matter most.